the teacher who refused to give up. She was the kind of teacher you never forgot. Not because she demanded attention, but because she saw what no one else bothered to see. In a school where some students were written off before they even began, Miss Grace stood quietly in the shadows until one moment forced her into the light. And when she acted, it wasn't just a lesson for her class. It was a lesson for an entire town. Welcome to ELIZA'S Stories. We hope you have a relaxing time enjoying our story. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like, share, and subscribe. Thank you, Miss Grace, the gentle teacher. In the quiet corridors of Willowbrook Elementary School in Cedar Falls, Connecticut, there lived a teacher whose gentleness seemed almost out of place in the harsh world of education. Miss Grace moved through the hallways like a whisper, her worn cardigan draped over shoulders that had learned to carry burdens far too heavy for someone so young. Her classroom, tucked away in the corner of the aging brick building, was a sanctuary of sorts. The walls were covered with children's artwork and inspirational quotes written in her delicate handwriting. Sunlight filtered through windows that she kept spotlessly clean, casting golden rectangles across rows of small desks that she arranged with mathematical precision each morning. Miss Grace had been teaching at Willowbrook for 3 years now, and in that time, she had developed a reputation among her colleagues. They whispered that she was too soft, too kind for the demanding world of elementary education. Principal Stone, a woman whose presence filled rooms like a thundercloud, often remarked that Miss Grace lacked the necessary authority to properly manage children, but the children themselves knew better. They sensed something different about Miss Grace, something that made them want to learn, to please, to be better versions of themselves. She never raised her voice, never used harsh words, yet somehow her classroom was always the most peaceful in the entire school. On this particular September morning, as autumn painted the maple trees outside her windows in shades of amber and crimson, Miss Grace prepared for a new school year. She carefully arranged fresh flowers from her tiny garden in a mason jar on her desk, their purple petals adding a splash of color to the otherwise drab classroom. The children began filing in at exactly 8:15, their chatter filling the previously quiet space. Miss Grace greeted each one by name, her voice soft but warm, her smile genuine, despite the weariness that seemed to follow her like a shadow. She had spent the weekend learning every child's name from their enrollment files, a practice that never failed to surprise both students and parents. Among the familiar faces was one that immediately caught her attention, a small girl with dark, intelligent eyes and an air of quiet confidence that seemed unusual for someone so young. Her enrollment form read Emma Blake, age 6, though Miss Grace suspected this child possessed wisdom far beyond her years. Emma took her assigned seat in the 3rd row, her movements precise and deliberate. Unlike the other children who fidgeted and whispered, she sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly on her desk, her gaze fixed intently on Miss Grace. "Good morning, class," Miss Grace began, her voice carrying easily across the room without needing to be raised. "I'm Miss Grace, and I'm so excited to be your teacher this year." She paused, letting her eyes meet each child's gaze. "This classroom is going to be our home away from home, a place where we learn, grow, and discover amazing things about ourselves and the world around us." As the morning progressed, Miss Grace began her usual routine of assessing her new students. She asked them to write their names, to draw a picture of their family, to share one thing they loved about school. Most children responded typically: messy handwriting, stick figure drawings, answers about recess and lunch. Emma Blake was different. Her handwriting was impeccable, each letter formed with the precision of someone much older. Her family drawing showed remarkable detail and artistic skill. But it was her answer about school that made Miss Grace pause. "I love reading," Emma had written in her perfect penmanship, "because books take me to places where anything is possible, where people can be who they truly are meant to be." Miss Grace found herself reading the sentence twice. Struck by its depth, she glanced up at Emma, who was sitting quietly, watching her teacher with those penetrating dark eyes. For a moment, their gazes met, and Miss Grace felt an odd sensation, as if this 6-year-old child could see straight through to her soul. The first week of school passed in the typical blur of establishing routines and learning names, but Miss Grace found herself increasingly fascinated by Emma Blake. The child read at a level far above her grade, solved mathematical problems with ease, and demonstrated a vocabulary that occasionally surprised even her teacher. More intriguing still were the small, inexplicable incidents that seemed to occur whenever Emma was particularly focused or emotional. A pencil that rolled off a desk and somehow ended up back in Emma's hand. A book that fell from a shelf and landed open to exactly the page the class was discussing. Papers that seemed to organize themselves when Emma stared at them intently. Miss Grace, being a practical woman, despite her gentle nature, initially dismissed these observations as coincidence or her own tired imagination. She had been working late every evening, grading papers by candlelight in her tiny, barely furnished apartment. Perhaps she was simply seeing things. But the incidents continued, and gradually, Miss Grace began to pay closer attention. She noticed that Emma seemed to know things before they happened. When it was going to rain, when Principal Stone was approaching their classroom, when another child was about to become upset, the girl had an uncanny awareness that extended beyond normal childhood intuition. One particularly memorable morning in early October, Miss Grace was struggling with an old, temperamental overhead projector that refused to work properly. The bulb flickered on and off, casting erratic shadows across the wall where she was trying to display a reading exercise. The children grew restless as she fumbled with the machine, trying various adjustments that yielded no results. "I'm sorry, class," Miss Grace said, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She jiggled a loose connection, and the projector made a grinding noise before going completely dark. From her seat in the third row, Emma was watching intently. Miss Grace noticed the child's eyes narrow slightly, her small hands pressed flat against her desk. Then, without any warning or apparent cause, the projector hummed to life, displaying the reading exercise perfectly on the wall. Miss Grace stared at the machine, then at Emma, who was now looking down at her hands with a small, satisfied smile. The other children cheered and returned their attention to the lesson, but Miss Grace remained frozen for a moment, her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. That afternoon, as the children filed out for dismissal, Miss Grace asked Emma to stay behind for a moment. The child approached her desk with calm confidence, showing no signs of the nervousness that usually accompanied such requests. "Emma," Miss Grace began carefully, "I've noticed some unusual things happening in our classroom." She paused, unsure how to continue. "Things that seem to happen when you're concentrating very hard." Emma tilted her head slightly, studying her teacher's face. "You're not afraid," she observed, her voice matter-of-fact. Most adults would be afraid. The simple statement confirmed what Miss Grace had been suspecting, yet hearing it spoken aloud still sent a shiver down her spine. "Should I be afraid?" she asked gently. "No," Emma replied. "I would never hurt you. Miss Grace, you're kind to me. You're kind to everyone, even when they don't deserve it." She paused, her young face suddenly seeming much older. "Not many people are truly kind anymore." Miss Grace knelt down so she was at Emma's eye level, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Emma, what you can do, it's very special, but it's also something that might frighten people who don't understand." Emma nodded gravely. "I know. That's why I try to be careful. But sometimes, when I see people being hurt, or when something isn't fair," she trailed off, her small hands clenching into fists. "What happens then?" Miss Grace asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Things happen," Emma said simply. "Things that maybe should happen to make things right again." Miss Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the classroom windows. She recognized something in Emma's tone, a sense of justice that seemed both admirable and potentially dangerous in someone so young and so powerful. Over the following weeks, Miss Grace found herself becoming more than just Emma's teacher. She became her confidant, the one adult in the child's life who accepted her extraordinary abilities without fear or judgment. Emma, in turn, began to trust Miss Grace with small demonstrations of her power. She would make flowers bloom more brightly, cause chalk to write on the board by itself, or quietly help struggling classmates by making their pencils guide them toward correct answers. Miss Grace watched these small miracles with a mixture of wonder and growing concern. The concern wasn't for Emma's abilities themselves, but for the child's home situation, which gradually revealed itself through casual conversations and careful observation. Emma rarely spoke of her family, but when she did, Miss Grace detected notes of loneliness and frustration that no 6-year-old should have to carry. Mr. and Mrs. Blake, Miss Grace learned from brief parent conferences, were not unkind people, but they were completely absorbed in their own interests. Mr. Blake sold used cars and spent his evenings watching television with single-minded devotion. Mrs. Blake was obsessed with her appearance and spent her days at the beauty salon or shopping mall. Neither parent seemed to recognize their daughter's exceptional intelligence or her desperate need for intellectual stimulation and emotional connection. They dismissed her advanced reading as showing off and her thoughtful questions as being difficult. Their son Tyler, Emma's older brother, had inherited his parents' disdain for anything academic and often teased Emma cruelly about her love of books. Miss Grace's heart ached for this brilliant, lonely child who possessed abilities that could change the world, yet lived in a home where such gifts were neither understood nor valued. She began staying after school to work with Emma, not because the child needed academic help, but because she sensed Emma needed someone who could appreciate her remarkable mind. During these after-school sessions, Emma would sometimes let her guard down completely, allowing her powers to flow more freely. Books would float from shelves to her hands, pencils would dance through the air, writing out poetry. And once, memorably, she had made every flower in Miss Grace's garden bloom simultaneously, creating a burst of color visible from the classroom window. "How long have you been able to do these things?" Miss Grace asked one afternoon as they worked together on an advanced mathematics problem that would have challenged high school students. Emma considered the question carefully. "I think always," she said finally. "But it got stronger when I got angry about things being unfair, and stronger still when I learned to read and discovered that there were people in the world who cared about justice and kindness and making things better." Miss Grace nodded, understanding more than Emma might have expected. She too had learned early in life that the world could be unfair, that kindness was often mistaken for weakness, and that sometimes the people who should protect and nurture children were the very ones who failed them most completely. As autumn deepened into winter, the bond between teacher and student grew stronger. Miss Grace began to share small details about her own life, how she lived in a tiny apartment with secondhand furniture, how she grew her own vegetables because fresh food was expensive, how she sometimes went hungry so her students could have supplies their parents couldn't afford. Emma listened to these revelations with the intense focus she brought to everything, her dark eyes reflecting an understanding far beyond her years. She began bringing small gifts, a perfect apple from the grocery store, a flower from someone's garden that had fallen into her path, a book she had somehow acquired and insisted Miss Grace should have. Miss Grace tried to refuse these offerings at first, but Emma's earnest insistence and the obvious joy she took in giving made refusal seem cruel. Besides, Miss Grace was beginning to understand that these gifts represented something much deeper than simple generosity. They were Emma's way of caring for the one adult who had shown her true understanding. One particularly cold December morning, Miss Grace arrived at school to find her classroom unusually warm, despite the building's notoriously inadequate heating system. Emma was already at her desk, reading a book that looked far too advanced for any elementary student. She looked up as Miss Grace entered, and for just a moment, the heating vents seemed to blow a little warmer. "Good morning, Miss Grace," Emma said with her characteristic calm politeness. "I thought you might be cold today." Miss Grace set down her bag and looked around the classroom, noting that while the hallway had been frigid, her room felt perfectly comfortable. "Thank you, Emma," she said simply, understanding, passing between them without need for further explanation. As the other children arrived, chattering about the snow that had begun falling overnight, Miss Grace watched Emma carefully. The child had grown more confident in recent weeks, more willing to let small manifestations of her abilities show. But Miss Grace had also noticed something else, a growing frustration that seemed to simmer beneath Emma's calm exterior. The source of this frustration became clear during their lunch period. Miss Grace often ate in her classroom, grading papers while she had a few minutes of quiet. Emma had taken to joining her, preferring the peaceful environment to the chaos of the cafeteria. Miss Grace, Emma said one day, unwrapping a sandwich that looked suspiciously more appetizing than the basic lunch Miss Grace had packed for herself. Do you ever get angry about things being unfair? Miss Grace paused in her grading, sensing the weight behind the question. Yes, Emma, I think everyone does sometimes. Why do you ask? Emma was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window where snow continued to fall steadily. There are children in our school who are hungry, but Principal Stone spent money on new curtains for her office instead of better lunch programs. There are students who need help reading, but she won't hire more tutors because she wants a bigger salary for herself. Miss Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Emma's observations were not only accurate, but demonstrated a level of awareness about the school's politics that should have been impossible for a child her age to possess. How do you know about these things, Emma? Miss Grace asked gently. I listen, Emma replied simply. Adults think children don't understand their conversations, but I understand more than they think. I understand that Principal Stone cares more about power and money than about helping children learn. The way Emma said Principal Stone made Miss Grace shiver slightly. There was something in the child's tone, not hatred exactly, but a cold assessment that suggested Emma had taken the measure of Principal Stone and found her severely wanting. Emma, Miss Grace said carefully, what you've observed about Principal Stone, you may be right about some of those things, but it's important that you don't do anything unusual about it. Some people wouldn't understand your abilities, and they might try to hurt you or take you away from people who care about you. Emma turned to look at her teacher directly, and Miss Grace was struck again by how adult those dark eyes seemed. I would never let anyone hurt you, Miss Grace. You're the only person who has ever been truly kind to me. The simple statement broke Miss Grace's heart. She reached across the small table where they sat and gently touched Emma's hand. You deserve kindness, Emma. You deserve so much more than you've been given. For just a moment, Emma's composure cracked, and Miss Grace saw the lonely, hurt child beneath the extraordinary abilities. Sometimes I wish I was normal, Emma whispered. Sometimes I think it would be easier if I couldn't see how mean people really are, or how unfair everything is. But then you couldn't help make things better, Miss Grace replied softly. And I think that's why you have these gifts, Emma, to help make the world a little more fair, a little more kind. Emma smiled then, the first truly childlike expression Miss Grace had seen from her in weeks. Is that what you think? That I'm supposed to help people? I think, Miss Grace said, choosing her words carefully, that you have been given something very special. And with special gifts come special responsibilities. The question is, what kind of person do you want to be? Emma considered this seriously, as she considered everything. I want to be like you, she said finally. Someone who helps people, who stands up for what's right, who makes children feel safe and loved. Miss Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. Emma, you already are those things. You just need to be careful how you use your gifts. As winter progressed into the new year, Miss Grace noticed changes in Emma beyond just her growing confidence with her abilities. The child began asking more pointed questions about Miss Grace's life outside of school. She wanted to know where Miss Grace lived, why she seemed tired so often, why her clothes were always the same. Few outfits rotated week after week. Miss Grace deflected most of these questions, not wanting to burden a child with the reality of her financial struggles. But Emma was perceptive beyond her years, and Miss Grace suspected the child had already deduced more than she let on. The truth was that Miss Grace's life outside of school was a constant struggle. Her tiny apartment was in one of the least desirable parts of Cedar Falls, a converted attic space with slanted ceilings and windows that leaked cold air in winter. Her salary as a teacher barely covered rent and basic necessities, leaving little for anything beyond survival. She had no family to fall back on, no safety net of any kind. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 18, leaving her with nothing but student loans and the determination to become the kind of teacher who could make a difference in children's lives. She had succeeded in that goal, but at the cost of any personal comfort or security. Miss Grace often wondered if she should have chosen a different profession, something that would have provided better financial stability. But every day, when she saw the light of understanding dawn in a struggling student's eyes, or when a shy child found the courage to speak up in class, or when someone like Emma trusted her with their deepest secrets, she knew she was exactly where she belonged. Emma seemed to sense her teacher's dedication and sacrifice, even without knowing the full details. She began small acts of what Miss Grace could only call magical kindness, ensuring that Miss Grace's car started on cold mornings, making sure there were always enough supplies in the classroom, even when the budget ran short, somehow arranging for Miss Grace's favorite coffee to appear on her desk on particularly difficult days. One February afternoon, as a fierce snowstorm battered the windows of their classroom, Emma approached Miss Grace's desk after the other children had been dismissed. "Miss Grace," she said in her serious, adult-like manner, "I think you're sad about something more than just being tired." Miss Grace looked up from the papers she was grading, surprised by Emma's directness. "What makes you think that, sweetie?" Emma climbed onto the chair beside Miss Grace's desk, settling herself with characteristic composure. "Sometimes when you think no one is looking, your face gets very sad, and sometimes I can feel that you're afraid of something." The child's perceptiveness was both comforting and unsettling. Miss Grace had tried so hard to maintain a positive demeanor for her students, but apparently her efforts hadn't fooled Emma. "Everyone gets sad sometimes, Emma," Miss Grace said gently. "It's part of being human, but your sadness is different." Emma persisted. "It's not just regular sad. It's the kind of sad that comes from people being mean to you for a long time." Miss Grace stared at Emma, wondering how this child could see so clearly into her heart. "Emma, where did you learn to understand people so well?" Emma shrugged, a gesture that seemed almost too casual for someone who never did anything without careful consideration. "I've always been able to tell what people are really feeling. Most adults try to hide their real feelings, but they can't hide them from me." Miss Grace realized that Emma's extraordinary abilities extended far beyond moving objects with her mind. The child possessed an emotional intelligence, an intuitive understanding that allowed her to see past the masks people wore, to the truth beneath. "What do you see when you look at me?" Miss Grace asked, genuinely curious despite her discomfort with being so transparent. Emma studied her teacher's face with intense concentration. "I see someone who is very kind and very brave, but also very alone. I see someone who gives everything to other people and doesn't save anything for herself. And I see someone who is afraid of a person who hurt her very badly." Miss Grace felt her breath catch. Emma's assessment was so accurate, it was frightening. "Emma, how could you possibly know?" "Because I recognize it," Emma said simply. "The look you get sometimes is the same look I see in the mirror when I think about my family. When I think about people who are supposed to love me, but don't really know how." The parallel Emma drew between their situations struck Miss Grace like a physical blow. Here was this extraordinary child, gifted beyond imagination, yet carrying the same wounds of emotional neglect and loneliness that Miss Grace had carried for most of her life. "Emma," Miss Grace said softly, "you and I, we understand each other, don't we?" Emma nodded solemnly. "We both know what it feels like to be different, to be alone, to have people not understand us." She paused, her dark eyes growing intense. "But we're not alone anymore, are we? We have each other." Miss Grace felt tears threatening again. "Yes, Emma, we do have each other." As if sensing her teacher's emotional state, Emma reached out and took Miss Grace's hand in both of hers. For just a moment, Miss Grace felt a strange sensation, as if warmth and comfort were flowing directly from the child's touch into her heart. "Miss Grace," Emma said quietly, "if someone was hurting you and I could make them stop, would you want me to?" The question sent alarm bells ringing in Miss Grace's mind. "Emma, what do you mean?" Emma's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "I mean that if someone was being mean to you, or scary, or making you sad, I could make them go away. I could make them so afraid that they would never bother you again." Miss Grace gently extracted her hands from Emma's grasp, her heart racing. "Emma, listen to me very carefully. You must never, ever use your abilities to hurt people, no matter how much they might deserve it. That's not what makes a person good." Emma's face showed disappointment, mixed with confusion. "But what if they're really bad people? What if they hurt children, or take things that don't belong to them?" "Even then," Miss Grace said firmly, "the moment we use our power to hurt others, even people who are doing wrong, we become part of the problem instead of part of the solution." Emma considered this for a long moment, her young mind wrestling with concepts of justice and morality that would challenge adults. "So what do we do when bad people won't stop being bad?" Miss Grace thought about her own experiences, about the person Emma had somehow sensed was a source of fear in her life. We find other ways to protect ourselves and the people we care about. We use our intelligence, our kindness, our ability to help others see the truth. And if that doesn't work, Emma pressed. Miss Grace met her students' intense gaze. Then sometimes we have to be very brave and ask for help from people who can make the right kind of changes. Emma nodded slowly, but Miss Grace could see that the child wasn't entirely satisfied with this answer. There was something in Emma's expression that suggested she had already identified specific injustices that needed addressing, and that her teacher's gentle approach might not align with Emma's more direct sense of justice. As the school year progressed toward the spring, Miss Grace noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere at Willowbrook Elementary. Small things began going wrong for people who had been particularly unkind or unfair. The school bully found himself inexplicably tripping whenever he tried to intimidate smaller children. A teacher who had been cruel to students with learning disabilities discovered that her lesson plans kept mysteriously rearranging themselves. Most notably, Principal Stone began experiencing a series of minor but unsettling incidents. Her office door would slam shut at inappropriate moments. Her computer would freeze whenever she tried to access files related to budget cuts that would hurt students. Her coffee would turn cold the instant she began complaining about teacher salaries. Miss Grace suspected Emma's involvement, but couldn't prove it. And truthfully, part of her didn't want to. The incidents were harmless enough, more like cosmic justice than actual revenge, but she worried about where such behavior might lead if left unchecked. One warm April afternoon, as cherry blossoms bloomed outside their classroom window, Miss Grace decided to address her concerns directly. "Emma," she said as they worked together after school, "I've noticed some unusual things happening around the school lately." Emma looked up from the advanced calculus problem she was solving for fun. "What kind of unusual things?" "The kind that happen when someone with special abilities gets frustrated with unfairness," Miss Grace said carefully. Emma's expression remained neutral, but Miss Grace caught a flicker of something. Guilt, perhaps, or defiance in those dark eyes. "Miss Grace," Emma said finally, "what if I told you that sometimes justice needs a little help? That sometimes people who hurt others need to understand what it feels like to be hurt?" "I would say that I understand the feeling," Miss Grace replied honestly, "but I would also say that the kind of person you want to become, the kind of person you told me you wanted to be, doesn't seek revenge, even when it's deserved." Emma set down her pencil and looked directly at her teacher. "Then what kind of person fights back when someone is being hurt? What kind of person protects people who can't protect themselves?" The questions cut straight to the heart of Miss Grace's own struggles with justice and morality. She thought about her own situation, about the person who had hurt her so deeply, about her own inability to fight back effectively. "The kind of person who finds a way to create real change," she said finally. "Not just punishment, but actual solutions that help everyone." Emma nodded thoughtfully, like making sure Principal Stone understands that being mean to teachers and students isn't acceptable. Miss Grace felt a chill. "Emma, what exactly have you been doing?" Before Emma could answer, they heard the sharp click of high heels in the hallway outside their classroom. Both teacher and student tensed as the footsteps stopped directly outside their door. Principal Stone entered without knocking, her imposing figure filling the doorway. She was a tall, severe woman with steel gray hair, pulled back in a tight bun, and eyes that seemed to look for fault in everything around her. "Miss Grace," Principal Stone said in her commanding voice, "I need to speak with you." Immediately, Miss Grace felt Emma stiffen beside her, and for just a moment, she thought she felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "Of course, Principal Stone," Miss Grace replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Emma, would you please gather your things? Your parents will be here soon." As Emma packed her books with deliberate slowness, Miss Grace caught her eye and gave her a meaningful look. The message was clear. "Whatever happens, do nothing unusual." Emma nodded almost imperceptibly, but as she walked past Principal Stone toward the door, Miss Grace noticed the woman shiver slightly and pull her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "I'll see you tomorrow." "Miss Grace," Emma said politely, but there was something in her tone that sounded almost like a promise of protection. After Emma left, Principal Stone closed the classroom door and turned to face Miss Grace. with an expression of barely controlled frustration. "Miss Grace," she began, her voice tight with anger, "I've been experiencing some very strange incidents lately. Technical problems, equipment malfunctions, minor accidents that all seem to occur whenever I'm dealing with matters related to your classroom or your teaching methods." Miss Grace kept her expression carefully neutral. "I'm sorry to hear you're having difficulties. Principal Stone, is there something specific you think I can help you with?" Principal Stone's eyes narrowed. "Don't play innocent with me. There's something very odd about your classroom, about that child, Emma Blake, and about the way certain things seem to happen around here lately." Miss Grace felt a protective instinct flare up, stronger than anything she had felt in years. "Principal Stone, Emma is an exceptional student who deserves our support and encouragement, not suspicion. Exceptional is one word for it," Principal Stone muttered. Then, louder, "Miss Grace, I'm warning you. Whatever games you think you're playing, whatever little schemes you and that strange child have cooked up, they need to stop now." The threat in Principal Stone's voice was unmistakable, and Miss Grace felt the familiar fear that had haunted her for so long. But underneath the fear was something new, a fierce determination to protect Emma from the kind of crushing authority that had once devastated her own life. "Principal Stone," Miss Grace said quietly, "I think you may be imagining connections that don't exist. Emma is a bright child who loves to learn, and I'm simply trying to provide her with the education she deserves." Principal Stone stepped closer, her presence intimidating in the small classroom. "Let me be very clear, Miss Grace. I have been running schools for 20 years, and I know trouble when I see it. That child is trouble, and you are enabling her. Unless things change very quickly, you may find yourself looking for a new position." The threat hung in the air between them, and Miss Grace felt her world tilt slightly. She needed this job desperately. Without it, she would lose her apartment, her independence, everything she had worked so hard to build. But as she looked at Principal Stone's cold, calculating eyes, Miss Grace realized that this moment was about more than just her job. It was about choosing what kind of person she wanted to be, what kind of stand she was willing to take. "Principal Stone," Miss Grace said, her voice steady despite her fear, "Emma Blake is under my protection as her teacher. I will continue to support her education and well-being to the best of my ability." Principal Stone's expression darkened. "We'll see about that, Miss Grace. We'll see about that." As the principal left, her heels clicking ominously down the hallway, Miss Grace sank into her chair and realized that everything was about to change. She had just declared war on the most powerful person in the school, and she had done it to protect a child whose abilities she was only beginning to understand. Outside her window, the cherry blossoms swayed in the spring breeze, and Miss Grace couldn't shake the feeling that Emma had somehow heard every word of the conversation. Despite being long gone from the building, the battle lines had been drawn, and Miss Grace suspected that Principal Stone had no idea what kind of forces she had just challenged. But Miss Grace knew, and for the first time in years, she felt something that might have been hope mixing with her fear. Emma Blake was not just any child, and Miss Grace was no longer the helpless victim she had once been. Together, they might just be strong enough to face whatever came next. Miss Grace. Secrets revealed. That evening, Miss Grace sat in her tiny apartment, staring out the single window at the darkening sky over Cedar Falls. The confrontation with Principal Stone had left her shaken, not just because of the immediate threat to her job, but because it had awakened memories she had spent years trying to bury. The apartment was sparse, furnished with items she had collected from thrift stores and garage sales over the years. A small table served as both dining surface and desk, covered now with student papers she couldn't concentrate on grading. The walls were bare, except for a single framed photograph that she kept turned face down most of the time. Tonight, however, she found herself reaching for that photograph, her hands trembling slightly as she turned it over. The image showed a much younger version of herself, perhaps 8 years old, standing beside a tall, gentle-looking man with kind eyes and a warm smile. They were in front of a beautiful Victorian house, with wraparound porches and gardens that seemed to stretch on forever. The man was her father, Dr. Jonathan Grace, and the house had been their family home on Elm Street, just 3 miles from where she now lived in poverty. But that felt like another lifetime, another world entirely. Miss Grace closed her eyes and let herself remember, really remember. For the first time in years, the memories came flooding back with painful clarity, starting with the day her peaceful world had been shattered forever. She had been 8 years old when her parents died in the car accident. One moment she was a beloved daughter, living in comfort and security. The next, she was an orphan with nowhere to go. Her father's will had named his sister, Margaret Stone, as Emma's guardian and the executor of his considerable estate. Margaret Stone, the woman who now terrorized children and teachers alike at Willowbrook Elementary, had once been simply Aunt Maggie, her father's younger sister, who visited occasionally and always seemed slightly resentful of the Grace family's happiness and prosperity. Miss Grace remembered the day Margaret had arrived to collect her from the temporary foster home where she'd been placed after the accident. Even then, there had been something cold and calculating in her aunt's eyes as she looked around the gracious family home that would now be hers to manage. "Well, Jennifer," Margaret had said, using Miss Grace's full first name with distaste, "I suppose we'll have to make the best of this situation. Your father has left you in my care, and this house and his money are now my responsibility." Young Jennifer Grace had been too numb with grief to understand the implications of those words. She had simply been grateful to have a family member, someone who would take care of her and help her navigate the overwhelming loss of everything she had known. But Margaret Stone, Miss Grace now understood, had never intended to be a guardian. She had been waiting for just such an opportunity, harboring years of jealousy toward her successful older brother and his perfect family. The accident had been a windfall, giving her control over a substantial inheritance and property that she had always believed should have been partially hers. The first few weeks in her aunt's care had been a gradual revelation of Margaret's true nature. The kindness she had shown during the funeral and legal proceedings evaporated as soon as they were alone. Margaret moved into the master bedroom immediately, relegating Jennifer to a small servant's room in the attic. The beautiful gardens were neglected, the house's warmth and welcoming atmosphere replaced by an oppressive silence. Worse than the material changes was Margaret's systematic emotional abuse. She made it clear that Jennifer was a burden, an unwanted responsibility that had been thrust upon her. Every meal, every piece of clothing, every basic necessity was presented as a generous favor that Jennifer should be grateful for. "Your father spoiled you," Margaret would say whenever Jennifer showed any sign of the confidence and joy she had once possessed. "He filled your head with nonsense about being special, about deserving good things. Well, that's over now. In the real world, people have to earn what they get." Miss Grace shuddered as she remembered those years of gradual, psychological destruction. Margaret had been clever about it, careful never to leave marks that teachers or neighbors might notice. The abuse was emotional, financial, and designed to systematically break down Jennifer's sense of self-worth. By the time Jennifer was 12, she had been transformed from a bright, confident child into a timid, anxious girl who jumped at shadows and apologized for existing. Margaret had convinced her that she was lucky to have a roof over her head, that she was too stupid and worthless to ever amount to anything. The inheritance that should have provided for Jennifer's education and future had been systematically diverted into Margaret's personal accounts. The family home, which should have been held in trust for Jennifer until she came of age, was mortgaged and remortgaged to fund Margaret's increasingly expensive lifestyle. Margaret had developed a taste for power and luxury during those years. She bought expensive clothes, took lavish vacations, and eventually began pursuing positions of authority. An authority where she could exert control over others. Education administration had appealed to her because it offered opportunities to dominate both children and adults while maintaining a veneer of respectability. Jennifer had watched helplessly as her inheritance disappeared, and her childhood home was gradually stripped of everything valuable. The beautiful antique furniture was sold piece by piece. Her father's extensive library, which had been Jennifer's refuge during the darkest days of her grief, was donated to make room for Margaret's contemporary decorating schemes. By the time Jennifer turned 16, the house itself was heavily mortgaged, and Margaret was already making noises about the financial burden of supporting a teenager. She began hinting that Jennifer should be grateful if she was allowed to finish high school at all, that perhaps it was time for her to get a job and start contributing to household expenses. But Jennifer had inherited more than just her father's money. She had inherited his intelligence and his determination. Despite Margaret's attempts to crush her spirit, some part of her had survived, hidden but not destroyed. She began to plan her escape, studying harder than ever, and applying for scholarships that could get her to college and away from her aunt's control. The day Jennifer received her full scholarship to State University was both the happiest and most terrifying day of her teenage years. Margaret's reaction had been explosive. Rage mixed with panic as she realized her source of control and justification for accessing Jennifer's inheritance was about to disappear. "You ungrateful little brat," Margaret had screamed that night. "After everything I've sacrificed for you, this is how you repay me. Running off to college like you're someone special." Jennifer had stood her ground for the first time in years. "It's what my father would have wanted," she had said quietly. "He always said education was the most important gift he could give me." Margaret's face had turned purple with fury. "Your father was a fool who filled your head with impossible dreams. And when you fail, and you will fail, don't come crawling back to me for help." Miss Grace wiped away tears as she remembered that final confrontation. She had left for college the next week, with nothing but a single suitcase of clothes and the desperate determination to never return to her aunt's house. College had been both liberation and struggle. Free from Margaret's psychological abuse, Jennifer had begun to rediscover herself, to remember who she had been before grief and manipulation had nearly destroyed her. But financially, it had been brutal. The scholarship covered tuition and basic room and board, but there was nothing left for books, clothes, or any of the small comforts that might have made the experience easier. She worked multiple jobs throughout college, cleaning offices at night, tutoring other students, serving food in the cafeteria. Every penny went toward survival and education. There was no money for socializing, no resources for building the kind of friendships that might have provided emotional support. During those 4 years, Jennifer tried several times to contact Margaret about accessing what remained of her inheritance. She needed to know what had happened to her father's estate, whether there might be anything left to help with her education expenses. But Margaret had changed her phone number and refused to respond to letters. It wasn't until Jennifer's senior year that she learned the full extent of her aunt's betrayal. A family friend who had known her parents reached out, having heard through mutual acquaintances that Jennifer was struggling financially in college. "My dear," the elderly woman had said, during their meeting at a small cafe near campus, "I had no idea you were in such dire straits. Whatever happened to your father's estate, that house on Elm Street alone should have provided for your education and much more." Jennifer's blood had run cold as the full picture emerged. Her father had left a substantial inheritance, enough to pay for the finest education and to set her up comfortably for life. The house on Elm Street had been worth a fortune even then, and her father's investments and life insurance should have created a trust fund that would have lasted for decades. But Margaret Stone, as executor and guardian, had had complete legal control over these assets, and she had systematically stolen everything, using her guardianship as cover for what amounted to grand theft from an orphaned child. By the time Jennifer graduated from college with her teaching degree, there was nothing left. The house on Elm Street had been sold, the money from the sale having disappeared into Margaret's personal accounts. The investments had been liquidated, the life insurance money spent on Margaret's lifestyle, and her climb up the ladder of educational administration. Jennifer was left with nothing but her education and a crushing sense of betrayal that went beyond simple theft. Margaret hadn't just stolen her money. She had stolen her childhood, her sense of security, her faith in family and justice. Miss Grace opened her eyes and looked around her sparse apartment, understanding fully for the first time how she had ended up here. She wasn't poor because she had chosen the wrong profession or made bad financial decisions. She was poor because the woman who should have protected and nurtured her had instead systematically destroyed her future for personal gain. The cruelest irony was that Margaret Stone now held a position of power over her once again. When Jennifer had applied for the teaching position at Willowbrook Elementary 3 years ago, she hadn't initially realized that the principal Stone mentioned in her interview materials was her aunt. She had legally changed her first name to Grace during college, preferring the middle name her father had chosen over the Jennifer that carried so many painful associations. By the time she realized who her new boss would be, Jennifer was desperate enough for employment that she took the job anyway. Margaret had shown no sign of recognition during the hiring process, and Jennifer had hoped that enough time had passed, that she had changed enough, that they could coexist professionally without addressing their past. But Margaret Stone was not a woman who forgot anything, especially not someone she had once controlled so completely. Jennifer suspected that Margaret had known exactly who she was hiring, and that keeping her former victim in a position of professional subordination was just another form of psychological abuse. The thought that Emma might become another victim of Margaret's cruelty was unbearable. Miss Grace had seen how Margaret treated children who were different, who showed signs of intelligence or independence that threatened her need for absolute control. Emma's extraordinary abilities would make her a target for Margaret's particular brand of systematic destruction. Miss Grace's phone rang, interrupting her painful journey through memory. She glanced at the clock. Nearly 9 o'clock, late for anyone to be calling. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Hello," she answered cautiously. "Miss Grace." The voice was young and familiar. "It's Emma. I'm calling from my neighbor's phone." Miss Grace sat up straighter. "Emma, what's wrong?" "It's very late. I know, and I'm sorry to bother you. But I wanted to make sure you were okay after Principal Stone talked to you today." The concern in Emma's voice was touching, but also alarming. "Emma, how did you know that Principal Stone spoke to me after you left?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I could sense that you were upset when I saw you this morning, and I know Principal Stone has been angry about things lately." Miss Grace suspected there was more to Emma's knowledge than simple intuition, but she decided not to press the point over the phone. "I'm fine. Emma, you don't need to worry about grown-up problems." "Miss Grace," Emma's voice became very serious. "I think Principal Stone is a bad person. I think she hurts people just because she can." The assessment was so accurate, so precisely what Miss Grace had been thinking about for the past several hours, that it took her breath away. "Emma, what makes you say that?" "I can feel it when I'm near her," Emma explained. "There's something cold and mean inside her, something that enjoys making other people afraid. And I think," Emma paused, as if deciding whether to continue, "I think she's hurt you before. Not just today, but a long time ago." Miss Grace gripped the phone tighter. "Emma, that's a very perceptive observation, but it's also something we need to be very careful about discussing." "Miss Grace," Emma said urgently, "I want to help you. I know you've been sad for a long time, and I know Principal Stone is part of why. If you tell me what she did to you, I can make sure she never hurts you again." The offer, made with such sincere concern by a 6-year-old child, nearly broke Miss Grace's heart. "Emma, listen to me carefully. I appreciate that you want to help, but this is not a problem that can be solved with your special abilities. This is something that requires patience and careful planning." "But what if she tries to fire you?" Emma asked. "What if she tries to hurt you worse?" Miss Grace realized that Emma understood far more about the situation than any child should have to. "Emma, where are you calling from? Are you safe at home?" "I'm at Mrs. Patterson's house next door. My parents are fighting again, and I didn't want to listen to it. Mrs. Patterson said I could use her phone to call you." Miss Grace felt her heart ache for this brilliant child who carried so many burdens. "Emma, I want you to go back home now. Your parents are probably worried about you. They don't even know I'm gone," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Tyler is at his friend's house, and my parents are too busy yelling at each other to notice anything else." The casual way Emma described her family's dysfunction was heartbreaking. Miss Grace made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. "Emma," she said carefully, "would you like to come have breakfast with me tomorrow morning? Before school, we could meet at the little diner on Main Street at 7:30. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Emma's voice, bright with surprise and pleasure. "Really? You want to have breakfast with me?" "I do," Miss Grace said firmly. "I think it's time you and I had a real conversation about some important things." After Emma hung up, Miss Grace sat in her quiet apartment and realized that she was about to cross a line she had never crossed before. She was about to trust someone completely with the truth about her past, about Margaret Stone, about everything she had kept hidden for so many years. But Emma wasn't just anyone. She was a child with extraordinary abilities, who was being raised by people who couldn't begin to understand or appreciate her gifts. She was brilliant, intuitive, and already showing signs of the same protective instincts that had once driven Miss Grace to become a teacher. More than that, Emma had somehow seen through to the truth about Margaret Stone and about Miss Grace's hidden pain. If anyone deserved to know the full story, if anyone could be trusted with such dangerous knowledge, it was this remarkable child who had already chosen to place herself between Miss Grace and potential harm. Miss Grace looked again at the photograph of herself with her father, then carefully placed it face up on her table, where she could see it clearly. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like hiding from her past. Tomorrow, she would tell Emma everything, and together they would figure out how to face whatever Margaret Stone might do next. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with spring sunshine streaming through the windows of Murphy's Diner on Main Street. Miss Grace arrived early, choosing a corner booth where they could talk privately. She ordered coffee and waited, her stomach churning with nervous anticipation. Emma arrived exactly at 7:30, dressed neatly in her school clothes and carrying her backpack. She looked around the diner with interest before spotting Miss Grace and making her way over with characteristic composure. "Good morning, Miss Grace," Emma said, sliding into the booth across from her teacher. "Thank you for inviting me." "Good morning, Emma. I'm glad you could come," Miss Grace signaled the waitress. "What would you like for breakfast?" Emma ordered pancakes with surprising enthusiasm. The first truly childlike behavior Miss Grace had seen from her son in weeks. As they waited for their food, they made small talk about school and Emma's reading, but both were clearly aware that more serious conversations lay ahead. When their breakfast arrived, Miss Grace took a deep breath and began the most difficult conversation of her life. "Emma," she said quietly, "yesterday you said you thought Principal Stone had hurt me before. You were right." Emma looked up from her pancakes, her dark eyes immediately focused and serious. "I knew it," she said simply. "I could feel the fear when you looked at her. What I'm going to tell you," Miss Grace continued, "is very important, and it has to stay completely between us. Do you understand?" Emma nodded solemnly. "I promise, Miss Grace. I'll never tell anyone." Miss Grace believed her. Despite Emma's young age, there was something about her that inspired absolute trust. "Emma, Principal Stone is my aunt, my father's sister." Emma's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. "When I was 8 years old, just a little older than you are now, my parents died in a car accident. My aunt became my guardian, and she was supposed to take care of me and manage the money my father left for my education and future." Miss Grace paused, watching Emma's face. The child was listening with the intense concentration she brought to everything important. "But instead of taking care of me, my aunt hurt me. Not physically, but in other ways. She made me feel worthless and stupid. She told me I didn't deserve good things, and she stole all the money my father had left for me." Emma's face had gone very still, and Miss Grace could see anger building in those dark eyes, like storm clouds gathering. "She stole everything," Emma asked quietly. "Everything. The house where I grew up. All the money. Everything that should have been mine. By the time I was old enough to understand what had happened, it was too late to get any of it back." Emma set down her fork, her pancakes forgotten. "That's why you live in that tiny apartment. That's why you don't have nice things. That's why you're always worried about money." Miss Grace nodded, impressed once again by Emma's perceptive understanding. "Yes, and that's why I became a teacher. Even though it doesn't pay very much, I wanted to help children who might be going through difficult situations like I did." Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she had learned. When she spoke again, her voice was very controlled, but Miss Grace could hear the fury underneath. "She's still hurting you," Emma said. "She's your boss now, and she uses that power to make you afraid, just like she did when you were little." "Yes," Miss Grace admitted. "And Emma, I'm telling you this because I'm worried that she might try to hurt you too. You're special. You're different. And people like my aunt don't like children who are smarter or more capable than they expect." Emma's jaw tightened. "She can try," she said, and there was something in her tone that made Miss Grace shiver slightly. "Emma," Miss Grace said urgently, "you have to promise me that you won't do anything dangerous. I know you want to help. I know you want to protect me. But if you use your abilities against her, it could make everything much worse." Emma looked directly at her teacher, and Miss Grace saw something in those young eyes that was both reassuring and terrifying. "Miss Grace," Emma said carefully, What if there was a way to get back what she stole from you? What if there was a way to make sure she couldn't hurt anyone ever again? Emma, what are you thinking? Emma glanced around the diner to make sure no one was listening, then leaned forward and spoke in a whisper. I've been watching her. Miss Grace. I've been learning things about her, and I think she's still doing bad things. Not just to you, but to other people too. Miss Grace felt a chill of apprehension. What do you mean? She's been taking money from the school budget that's supposed to help students. She's been lying about test scores to make herself look better. And there are teachers who are afraid to say anything because they know she'll fire them if they complain. The accusations were serious, and Miss Grace realized that Emma's unusual perceptiveness extended to understanding complex adult corruption. Emma, how could you possibly know about these things? Emma's expression became slightly embarrassed. I can hear things sometimes. When people are talking in offices, when they think no one is listening, and I can read things on her computer when she's not looking. Miss Grace stared at her student, beginning to understand the full extent of Emma's abilities. Emma, you've been spying on Principal Stone. Not spying exactly, Emma said defensively. More like investigating. I wanted to understand why she made you so afraid. And what I found was that she's been hurting lots of people for a long time. Miss Grace realized that Emma had been conducting her own form of justice-seeking, using her extraordinary abilities to uncover the truth about Margaret Stone's corruption. It was both admirable and terrifying. Emma, Miss Grace said carefully, if what you're saying is true, if you have evidence of Principal Stone doing illegal things, then there are proper ways to address that. We could report her to the school board. Or to the authorities. Emma shook her head impatiently. Adults don't listen to children, Miss Grace, and they especially don't listen when the accusations are against someone in power. Besides, her voice dropped even lower. What I know and what I can prove are two different things. Miss Grace realized that Emma was right on both counts. A 6-year-old's testimony would carry little weight against an established administrator, and evidence obtained through supernatural means would be impossible to present in any official proceeding. So what are you suggesting? Miss Grace asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Emma's eyes grew bright with determination. I'm suggesting that sometimes justice needs help, Miss Grace. I'm suggesting that maybe it's time Principal Stone learn what it feels like to be afraid, to lose things that are important to her, to understand that her actions have consequences. The plan Emma was proposing was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Miss Grace could see the appeal. After years of feeling helpless and victimized, the idea of striking back was intoxicating, but she also understood the dangers. Emma, she said gently, I understand why you want to help me. I understand why you think Principal Stone deserves to be punished. But if we do this, if we use your abilities to fight back, we become something different than who we want to be. Emma considered this seriously, as she considered everything. Miss Grace, what if being good people means letting bad people hurt others? What if being kind means that cruel people never face consequences for their actions? The questions struck at the heart of every moral dilemma Miss Grace had wrestled with. During her years of suffering under Margaret's control, she had been good, she had been kind, she had tried to handle things through proper channels, and all it had gotten her was continued victimization and poverty. I don't know, Emma, she admitted honestly. I wish I had better answers for you. Emma reached across the table and took Miss Grace's hand in both of hers. Miss Grace, you saved me when I was alone and different, and nobody understood me. You made me feel like I was worth something. You protected me when Principal Stone wanted to hurt me. Miss Grace felt tears threatening. Emma, you don't need to. Yes, I do, Emma interrupted. You saved me, Miss Grace. Now let me save you. The simple statement, delivered with such conviction by a child who possessed the power to make it true, hung in the air between them. Miss Grace realized that Emma was offering her something she had never had before. Someone willing and able to fight for her, to protect her, to ensure that justice was finally served. For the first time in 20 years, Miss Grace allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to be free of Margaret Stone's shadow, to reclaim not just her inheritance, but her sense of dignity and worth. Emma, she said quietly, if we were to do something like this, it would have to be very carefully planned, and it would have to be something that couldn't be traced back to you or to your abilities. Emma's face lit up with satisfaction. I've been thinking about that too, Miss Grace. and I have some ideas. As they finished their breakfast and prepared to head to school, Miss Grace realized that she had just crossed a line she had never expected to cross. She had agreed to let a 6-year-old child fight her battles for her, using supernatural abilities to settle old scores and right ancient wrongs. It should have felt wrong, should have triggered every moral instinct she possessed. Instead, for the first time in years, Miss Grace felt something that might have been hope. Margaret Stone had created this situation through decades of cruelty and theft. Whatever happened next, she had brought it upon herself, and Emma Blake, with her extraordinary gifts and fierce sense of justice, might just be exactly what the situation required. Walking into Willowbrook Elementary that morning, Miss Grace felt different somehow. Stronger, more confident, no longer completely alone in her struggle. Emma walked beside her, looking perfectly normal to any casual observer. But Miss Grace could sense the power coiled beneath her student's calm exterior. The war that had been declared the previous afternoon was about to begin in earnest, and for the first time since she was 8 years old, Miss Grace believed she might actually win. Miss Grace. The confrontation. The following week began like any other at Willowbrook Elementary. But beneath the surface of routine classes and normal activities, something fundamental had shifted. Miss Grace moved through her daily tasks with a new sense of purpose. While Emma observed everything with the heightened awareness of a general planning a campaign, their alliance had given both teacher and student something they had never possessed before: hope, backed by power. Miss Grace no longer felt like the helpless victim she had been for 20 years, and Emma finally had a worthy cause for her extraordinary abilities. But Margaret Stone was not a woman who missed subtle changes in the people around her. She had spent decades honing her instincts for detecting weakness and rebellion, and she sensed that something was different about her formerly compliant niece. On Tuesday morning, Margaret appeared in Miss Grace's classroom during the lunch period, ostensibly to observe teaching methods, but actually to assert her authority and probe for signs of defiance. "Miss Grace," Margaret announced as she entered the room, "I'll be conducting a formal evaluation of your teaching performance this afternoon. I trust you have your lesson plans prepared and your students properly controlled." Miss Grace looked up from the reading assessments she was grading, meeting Margaret's cold gaze with steady composure. "Of course, Principal Stone. My students and I are always ready to demonstrate our progress." Something in Miss Grace's tone, too confident, too unafraid, made Margaret's eyes narrow slightly. "See that you are? I've been hearing concerning reports about your classroom management and your methods with certain difficult students." Both women knew she was referring to Emma, who was currently in the cafeteria with her classmates, but whose absence didn't diminish her presence in the conversation. "I'm not sure what concerns you're referring to," Miss Grace replied evenly. "My students are engaged, learning, and well-behaved. Our test scores and progress reports speak for themselves." Margaret stepped closer to Miss Grace's desk, her imposing figure casting a shadow across the papers spread there. "Let me be very clear, Miss Grace. I will not tolerate insubordination from my staff, and I will not allow disruptive influences to undermine the order of this school. Is that understood?" For a moment, the old fear flickered in Miss Grace's chest, the automatic response to Margaret's intimidation tactics that had been conditioned over years of abuse. But then she thought of Emma's fierce loyalty, of the plan they had begun to develop, of the possibility that this cycle of victimization might finally be broken. "I understand perfectly, Principal Stone," Miss Grace said, and this time there was something in her voice that made Margaret take an involuntary step backward. "I understand exactly what kind of person you are, and exactly what you're capable of." Margaret's face flushed with anger and surprise. Never before had her meek niece shown even a hint of backbone, let alone spoken with such pointed confidence. "What did you just say to me?" Margaret demanded. Miss Grace stood up slowly, drawing herself to her full height. She was still physically smaller than Margaret, but somehow the power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. "I said I understand you, Margaret," Miss Grace replied, using her aunt's first name with deliberate familiarity. "I understand that you've built your entire career on intimidating people who can't fight back. But I also understand that bullies are usually cowards at heart." Margaret's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. In 20 years of administrative authority, no teacher had ever dared to speak to her this way. The shock was so complete, that for a moment she couldn't formulate a response. "You're fired," she finally managed to say. "Clear out your desk immediately. You'll be escorted from the building within the hour." Miss Grace smiled, and there was something almost pitying in her expression. "No, Margaret, I don't think I will be." Before Margaret could respond to this impossible defiance, the lights in the classroom began to flicker. The temperature dropped noticeably, and a stack of papers on Miss Grace's desk lifted slightly, as if stirred by an unfelt breeze. Margaret looked around the room wildly, trying to identify the source of the disturbances. What's happening?" "I think," Miss Grace said calmly, "that this school has developed some unusual atmospheric problems. You might want to have the building inspected for electrical issues." The lights flickered again, more dramatically this time, and Margaret's coffee cup, which she had set on Miss Grace's desk, slid several inches across the surface before stopping at the edge. Margaret stared at the cup, then at the still flickering lights, then at Miss Grace's serene expression. This is impossible. "Many things seem impossible," Miss Grace replied, "until they happen." Margaret fled the classroom without another word, her heels clicking frantically down the hallway. Miss Grace sat back down at her desk, her heart pounding with adrenaline and amazement. Emma had been right. It felt extraordinary to finally fight back. From her position in the cafeteria, Emma sensed that something significant had just occurred. She couldn't hear the conversation in Miss Grace's classroom, but she had felt her teacher's emotional shift, from fear to determination to triumph. More importantly, she had felt Principal Stone's shock and growing terror. The campaign had begun. Over the next few days, Margaret Stone's carefully ordered world began to unravel in small, but increasingly unsettling ways. Her computer would freeze whenever she tried to access files related to budget irregularities or staff evaluations. Her office door would slam shut at inappropriate moments, sometimes trapping her inside during important meetings. The building's heating system seemed to develop a mind of its own, making her office uncomfortably cold whenever she was being particularly cruel to a student or teacher. Her carefully arranged desk would be found in complete disarray each morning, despite the building being locked and secured overnight. More disturbing still were the incidents that seemed to target her personally. Her car wouldn't start on days when she had planned to arrive early to intimidate staff members. Her morning coffee would turn bitter and undrinkable whenever she was planning disciplinary actions against teachers. Her reading glasses would disappear at crucial moments, only to reappear in impossible locations. But the most unnerving development was the growing sense that she was being watched. Margaret began to feel eyes on her constantly. Even when she was alone in her office, she would spin around quickly, expecting to catch someone spying on her, but the hallways were always empty. Emma, meanwhile, had become a master of invisible observation. Her abilities allowed her to monitor Margaret's activities without physical presence, sensing the principal's emotions and intentions from anywhere in the building. She watched Margaret's growing paranoia with satisfaction, carefully calibrating each supernatural incident to increase pressure without crossing into obviously impossible territory. The psychological warfare was having exactly the effect Emma had hoped for. Margaret Stone, who had built her career on absolute control and intimidation, was discovering what it felt like to be helpless and afraid. But Emma's investigation had also uncovered information that went far beyond mere revenge. Using her abilities to access Margaret's computer files and listen to private phone conversations, she had documented a pattern of financial corruption that stretched back years. Margaret had been systematically embezzling funds from the school district, diverting money intended for student programs into her personal accounts. She had falsified test scores and graduation rates to secure performance bonuses. She had taken kickbacks from contractors and suppliers, inflating costs for school improvements while pocketing the difference. Most damaging of all, Emma had discovered that Margaret maintained detailed files on staff members' personal lives, using private information to blackmail teachers into compliance. She had destroyed careers and reputations to maintain her power, ruining lives with the same casual cruelty she had shown to her orphaned niece 20 years earlier. Emma shared these discoveries with Miss Grace during their increasingly frequent private conversations. They met in the empty classroom after school, speaking in whispers as Emma laid out the evidence of Margaret's crimes with the methodical precision of a prosecutor building a case. "She's been stealing from the school for at least 5 years," Emma reported one afternoon in late April. "I found bank records hidden in encrypted files on her computer. She has 3 different accounts where she's been depositing money that should have gone to student programs. Miss Grace reviewed the handwritten notes Emma had compiled, amazed at the thoroughness of the child's investigation. "Emma, this is incredible work, but how are we going to use this information? You can't exactly testify about supernatural surveillance in court." Emma smiled, and there was something almost adult in her expression. "Miss Grace, I've been thinking about that too. What if the evidence just appeared where the right people could find it?" Over the following days, Emma began implementing the most sophisticated aspect of her plan. Using her telekinetic abilities, she carefully moved physical documents from Margaret's office to locations where they would be discovered by people who could take action. Copies of financial records appeared in the school board president's mailbox. Evidence of grade tampering was mysteriously delivered to the state education department. Documentation of staff blackmail found its way to the teachers' union headquarters. Each delivery was untraceable, appearing as if concerned whistleblowers were finally finding the courage to expose Margaret's corruption. The evidence was too detailed and well documented to dismiss, forcing officials to launch formal investigations. Margaret initially tried to dismiss the revelations as the work of disgruntled employees or vindictive former staff members. But as more evidence emerged and investigators began examining her financial records, she realized that someone had comprehensive knowledge of her most closely guarded secrets. The pressure began to take a visible toll on Margaret's previously unshakable confidence. She started arriving at school later and leaving earlier, spending hours in her office with the door closed. Her usual authoritarian demeanor gave way to nervous paranoia. As she tried to identify the source of the leaks, she suspected everyone: teachers, custodial staff, district administrators, even students. But her suspicions never focused on the quiet first-grade teacher who had once been her helpless niece, or the brilliant 6-year-old who watched everything with knowing eyes. By early May, Margaret's world was crumbling on multiple fronts. The school board had placed her on administrative leave pending the outcome of their investigation. The district attorney's office had opened a criminal inquiry into her financial activities. Local news media had picked up the story, painting her as a corrupt administrator who had betrayed the trust of parents and students. But Emma wasn't finished. The most personal aspect of their campaign was yet to come. Using property records and financial documents she had copied from Margaret's files, Emma had traced the money trail back to its source: Miss Grace's stolen inheritance. Margaret had used the house on Elm Street as collateral for loans that funded her lifestyle and career advancement. The property had eventually been sold, but the money had been carefully hidden in accounts that could be tracked by someone with Emma's unique investigative abilities. "Miss Grace," Emma said during one of their evening conversations, "I found your father's house." Miss Grace looked up from the essays she was grading, her attention immediately focused. "What do you mean?" "I found what happened to the money from when she sold it," Emma explained. "She invested it in real estate and stocks, and those investments have grown a lot over the years. The money she stole from you is now worth almost $1 million. Miss Grace stared at Emma in shock. "$1 million?" Emma nodded solemnly. "And I know exactly where she hid it. I also found copies of legal documents that prove she stole it from you illegally. With these documents, you could take her to court and get everything back." The possibility of financial security, of justice finally served, was almost overwhelming. Miss Grace had lived in poverty for so long that the idea of reclaiming her inheritance felt like a fantasy. "Emma, how could we possibly prove that she stole the money? It's been 20 years, and all the legal paperwork shows her as my legal guardian with the right to manage the estate." Emma's expression grew determined because she kept records of everything. "Miss Grace, she's paranoid about money, so she documented every transaction, every transfer, every investment. And some of those records show that she knew she was supposed to hold the money in trust for you until you turned 21. Emma had discovered Margaret's fatal flaw: her compulsive need to control and document every aspect of her financial schemes. In her arrogance, Margaret had kept detailed records that could now be used as evidence against her. "The statute of limitations might protect her from criminal charges," Emma continued, "but civil law is different. You can still sue to recover money that was stolen from you, especially if you can prove fraud and breach of fiduciary duty." Miss Grace marveled at Emma's sophisticated understanding of legal concepts. Emma, how do you know about all these legal terms? Emma smiled slightly. I've been reading a lot of law books lately. The public library has an excellent legal section. That weekend, Emma put the final phase of their plan into motion. While Margaret was at home, consumed with damage control as news of her corruption continued to spread, Emma used her abilities to access the principal's home office. The house Margaret lived in was impressive. A large colonial on the affluent side of town, purchased with money that should have provided for Miss Grace's education and future. Emma moved through the house like a ghost, invisible and silent, locating Margaret's personal files and private documents. What she found exceeded even her expectations. Margaret had kept meticulous records, not just of her embezzlement from the school district, but of her theft from Miss Grace's inheritance. There were documents showing her deliberate conversion of trust funds into personal accounts, evidence of her systematic liquidation of Miss Grace's father's investments, and most damaging of all, correspondence with lawyers and financial advisors that clearly established her knowledge that her actions were illegal. Emma carefully photographed each document with a camera she had borrowed from the school's media center, creating a comprehensive record of Margaret's crimes. But she didn't stop there. Using her telekinetic abilities, Emma began rearranging Margaret's house in subtle but unmistakable ways. Books were moved from shelves to tables, furniture was shifted slightly out of place, personal items disappeared and reappeared in different rooms. The message was clear. Nowhere was safe, nothing was secure, and someone with unprecedented access was watching every move Margaret made. When Margaret returned home that evening, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. The house felt different, violated somehow, though nothing appeared to be missing. As she moved from room to room, she discovered the small but undeniable signs of intrusion. Her paranoia, already heightened by the investigations swirling around her, exploded into full-blown terror. She called the police, demanding they investigate the break-in, but the officers found no signs of forced entry and nothing obviously stolen. They suggested she might be under stress from work-related issues and recommended she consider installing a security system. But Margaret knew this was no ordinary break-in. Someone was targeting her specifically, someone with knowledge of her secrets and the ability to access supposedly secure locations. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. On Monday morning, Margaret arrived at school to find another devastating blow waiting for her. The school board had scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss her immediate termination. More evidence of her financial crimes had mysteriously appeared over the weekend, including bank records that traced stolen funds back to their original sources. Margaret sat in her office, staring at the termination notice, and realized that 20 years of carefully constructed power and control were collapsing around her. Worse still, she had no idea who was responsible or how to stop the systematic destruction of her life. She thought about the teachers she had intimidated over the years, the students she had crushed, the lives she had damaged in pursuit of personal power. Any one of them might have reason for revenge, but none of them had access to the kind of information that was being used against her. As Margaret struggled with her growing desperation, Miss Grace went about her daily teaching responsibilities with a calm confidence that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. Her students sensed the change in their teacher's demeanor. She was happier, more energetic, more present in ways they couldn't quite articulate. Emma, meanwhile, watched everything unfold with the satisfaction of someone seeing a carefully crafted plan reach its climax. But she also remained vigilant, ready to escalate their campaign if Margaret attempted any last-minute retaliation against Miss Grace. The confrontation Emma had been preparing for came sooner than expected. On Tuesday afternoon, Margaret burst into Miss Grace's classroom during the final period of the day, her usual composure completely shattered. The children looked up in alarm at the wild-eyed woman who stood in their doorway, breathing heavily and radiating barely controlled fury. "Everyone out," Margaret commanded, her voice harsh and unsteady. "Children, go to the library immediately." Miss Grace stood up slowly, positioning herself between Margaret and her students. "Principal Stone, the children are in the middle of their reading lesson. Perhaps we could discuss whatever is troubling you after now." Margaret screamed, causing several children to jump in fear. Emma remained in her seat, watching the confrontation with calm intensity, while her classmates filed out nervously. Miss Grace noticed Emma's stillness and gave her a subtle nod. permission to stay and witness whatever was about to unfold. When the last child had left, except for Emma, whom Margaret was too agitated to notice, Margaret slammed the door shut and advanced on Miss Grace. With 20 years of suppressed rage finally exploding to the surface. "You little witch," Margaret snarled, all pretense of professionalism abandoned. "You think I don't know what you're doing? You think I can't figure out that you're behind all of this?" Miss Grace met Margaret's fury with steady calm. "I'm not sure what you're talking about." "Margaret, perhaps you should speak to the counselor about the stress you seem to be experiencing." "Don't play innocent with me," Margaret shouted. "Someone has been stealing documents from my office, breaking into my house, accessing my private files, someone who knows things that only family would know." Miss Grace tilted her head slightly. "Family. Margaret, I wasn't aware you had any family left." The casual dismissal of their relationship, the complete erasure of 20 years of fear and submission, hit Margaret like a physical blow. "You ungrateful little brat. After everything I did for you, everything I sacrificed, everything you stole," Miss Grace corrected quietly. "Everything you destroyed, everything you took from a grieving child who trusted you." Margaret's face turned purple with rage. "You were nothing when I took you in. Nothing. Your father spoiled you rotten, filled your head with fantasies about being special. I taught you the truth about the real world. You taught me that people who should protect children sometimes hurt them instead," Miss Grace replied. "You taught me that power without compassion is just cruelty. But you also taught me something else, Margaret. You taught me that bullies are always, eventually, held accountable." Margaret raised her hand as if to strike Miss Grace, the same gesture of intimidation she had used countless times when her niece was small and helpless. But this time, her hand stopped mid-swing, frozen in place by an invisible force. Margaret struggled against the supernatural restraint, her eyes wide with terror, as she realized that something impossible was happening. Her hand trembled with effort, but she couldn't complete the motion. What's happening to me?" she gasped. From her desk in the third row, Emma spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. "I think," she said in her calm, adult voice, "that you're experiencing what it feels like when someone more powerful than you decides you've gone too far." Margaret spun around, finally noticing the child who had been silently observing everything. What are you doing here? I told all the children to leave." Emma stood up slowly, and as she did, the temperature in the room began to drop. The windows rattled slightly in their frames, and papers on Miss Grace's desk stirred as if blown by an unfelt wind. "You told the children to leave," Emma said, walking toward Margaret with measured steps. "But I'm not just any child. Am I Principal Stone?" Margaret backed away from Emma instinctively, though she couldn't have explained why a 6-year-old suddenly seemed so threatening. "Stay away from me," she whispered. Emma continued her approach, and with each step, the supernatural disturbances in the room intensified. Books began sliding off shelves. The lights flickered dramatically. Margaret's coffee cup lifted from the desk and hovered in midair, rotating slowly. "You've spent your whole life hurting people who couldn't fight back," Emma said, her young voice carrying absolute authority. "Children, teachers, anyone you thought was weaker than you. But you made one very big mistake. Principal Stone." Margaret was pressed against the classroom wall now, staring in terror at the floating coffee cup, and the child whose dark eyes seemed to see straight through to her soul. What mistake?" Margaret managed to ask. Emma smiled, and it was not a child's smile. "You hurt Miss Grace, and Miss Grace is under my protection now." The coffee cup suddenly shot across the room, shattering against the wall inches from Margaret's head. She screamed and dropped to her knees, covering her face with her hands. "Please," she begged. "Please don't hurt me. I'll do whatever you want." Emma stopped directly in front of Margaret, looking down at the cowering woman with cold satisfaction. "What I want," she said quietly, "is justice." Miss Grace watched the confrontation with a mixture of awe and concern. Emma's power was magnificent and terrifying, but she worried about what this moment might do to the child's soul. "Emma," she said gently, "I think Principal Stone understands now." Emma looked back at her teacher, and for a moment, her expression softened into something more recognizably childlike. "Do you want me to stop?" Miss Grace approached carefully, placing a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. "I want you to show her the same mercy she showed to the children and teachers she hurt. over the years. Emma considered this, then looked down at Margaret again. That would be no mercy at all. Margaret looked up at Emma with desperate eyes. What do you want from me? Money. I'll give you money. My resignation. I'll resign immediately. Just please, make this stop. Emma tilted her head, studying Margaret with clinical interest. What I want is very simple. Principal Stone, I want you to give Miss Grace back everything you stole from her. Every dollar, every investment, every penny that should have been hers. Margaret nodded frantically. Yes, yes, of course. Whatever you want. And I want you to leave Cedar Falls forever. Emma continued. I want you to go somewhere far away where you can never hurt children again. I will, Margaret promised. I'll leave tonight. I'll never come back. Emma smiled again, and this time there was something almost benevolent in her expression. Good, because if you don't keep your promises, Principal Stone, I will find you. No matter where you go, no matter how far you run, I will find you. And next time, I might not be so generous. To emphasize her point, Emma made every book in the classroom lift simultaneously from their shelves, hovering in perfect formation around the room, before settling back into place with gentle precision. Margaret stared at the impossible display, her mind struggling to process what she had witnessed. You're not human, she whispered. I'm exactly as human as you are, Emma replied. The difference is that I use my power to protect people, not to hurt them. Miss Grace stepped forward, looking down at her aunt, with 20 years of pain finally acknowledged. Margaret, you turned an orphan child into a victim because you were too selfish and cruel to be the guardian she needed. Now you're facing someone who won't let victims be created on her watch. Margaret struggled to her feet, her entire body shaking. The money. I'll transfer everything back to you by tomorrow. I have lawyers, financial advisors. They can handle the paperwork. You'll transfer every penny, Emma said firmly, including interest and growth on the investments you made with stolen funds. Miss Grace will be wealthy enough to never worry about money again. Margaret nodded desperately. Yes, everything. Just please, let me leave. Emma stepped aside, clearing a path to the door. Go pack your things. Principal Stone, you have 24 hours to make the transfers and disappear from Cedar Falls. If you're still here after that, she didn't need to finish the threat. Margaret fled from the classroom, her footsteps echoing frantically down the hallway. Miss Grace and Emma stood alone in the quiet classroom, surrounded by the aftermath of a confrontation 20 years in the making. Miss Grace felt as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders, as if she could breathe freely for the first time since childhood. Emma, she said softly, what you just did, are you okay? I know using your abilities like that must be difficult. Emma looked up at her teacher with eyes that seemed much older than her 6 years. Miss Grace, I've never felt better in my life. For the first time, I used my power to protect someone I love, instead of just being angry about things I couldn't change. Miss Grace knelt down and embraced Emma gently. You saved me, she whispered. After all these years of being afraid and alone, you saved me. Emma hugged her back fiercely. We saved each other. Miss Grace, you taught me that being different doesn't mean being alone, and now we're family. The kind of family that actually takes care of each other. As they held each other in the quiet classroom, both teacher and student understood that their lives had been fundamentally transformed. The old patterns of fear and helplessness were broken forever, replaced by the unshakable bond between two extraordinary people who had found each other exactly when they needed each other most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new possibilities. But tonight, for the first time in 20 years, Miss Grace would sleep without fear, protected by the fierce loyalty of a remarkable child who had chosen love over anger, justice over revenge, and hope over despair. Miss Grace, justice, and new beginnings. The morning after Margaret Stone's confrontation with Emma brought an unusual stillness to Willowbrook Elementary School. News of the principal's abrupt resignation had spread quickly through the building, creating an atmosphere of relief, mixed with uncertainty among both students and staff. Miss Grace arrived early, as was her custom, but for the first time in years, she walked through the corridors without the familiar weight of fear pressing down on her shoulders. The building felt different somehow, lighter, as if a dark cloud that had hung over the school for decades had finally been lifted. Emma was already in the classroom when Miss Grace arrived, sitting quietly at her desk with a thick legal document spread before her. She looked up as her teacher entered, and Miss Grace was struck by how much older Emma seemed, than just 24 hours earlier. "Good morning, Miss Grace," Emma said, her voice carrying a new note of satisfaction. "I have something to show you." Miss Grace set down her bag and approached Emma's desk, curious about the official-looking papers. "What is all this?" "Emma, financial transfer documents," Emma replied matter-of-factly. "Margaret worked very quickly last night. She's transferred $1.2 million into a new account with your name on it." Miss Grace stared at the documents, her mind struggling to process the numbers she was seeing. After 20 years of poverty, of carefully counting every penny, and going without basic necessities, the idea of suddenly having more money than she could spend in a lifetime felt surreal. "Emma, how did she manage to do all this so quickly?" Emma's expression held a hint of her old mischievous smile. "Fear is a powerful motivator, Miss Grace." She was very eager to keep her promises after yesterday's conversation. Miss Grace sank into the chair beside Emma's desk, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had happened. "This is really over, isn't it?" "She's really gone. She left Cedar Falls at 3 o'clock this morning," Emma confirmed. "I watched her pack her car and drive away. She won't be coming back." The simple certainty in Emma's voice was deeply reassuring. Miss Grace realized that she was finally, truly free from the shadow that had haunted her entire adult life. "Emma," she said softly, "what you've done for me, I don't know how to thank you." Emma reached out and took Miss Grace's hand, her small fingers surprisingly strong. "Miss Grace, you gave me the most important thing anyone has ever given me. You made me feel like I belonged somewhere. You showed me that being different could be a gift instead of a curse." Miss Grace squeezed Emma's hand gently. "What happens now? With your family? With school? With everything?" Emma's expression grew thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that. My parents, they don't really want me, Miss Grace. They never have. I'm too strange, too smart, too different from what they expected when they had a daughter." The casual way Emma discussed her parents' rejection broke Miss Grace's heart. No child should have to be so matter-of-fact about being unwanted by their own family. "And Tyler," Emma continued, "my brother, he's just like them. He thinks books are stupid and that anyone who likes to learn is showing off. We don't have anything in common." Miss Grace had met the Blake family during parent conferences and had sensed their disconnection from Emma even then. Mr. Blake had seemed more interested in his phone than in discussing his daughter's exceptional academic progress. Mrs. Blake had spent the entire meeting complaining about Emma's weird interests and her preference for reading over watching television. "Emma, what are you saying exactly?" Emma looked directly at her teacher with those penetrating dark eyes. "I'm saying that I think you need a family, Miss Grace, and I think I need a mother who understands me." The suggestion hung in the air between them, representing possibilities that Miss Grace had never allowed herself to consider. She had always assumed that her damaged childhood and unstable circumstances meant she would never have a family of her own. "Emma, that would be wonderful, but legally, it's very complicated. Your parents would have to agree to give up their parental rights. And even then, Miss Grace," Emma interrupted gently, "I think you're underestimating how much my parents would like to be free of the responsibility of raising a child they don't understand." Emma was right. Of course, Miss Grace had seen enough neglectful parents in her teaching career to recognize the signs. The Blakes weren't cruel to Emma, but they were profoundly indifferent, viewing her as an odd burden rather than a beloved daughter. "Besides," Emma added with a slight smile, "I may have some influence in helping them see that this arrangement would be best for everyone." Miss Grace felt a shiver of apprehension. "Emma, what do you mean by influence?" "Nothing harmful," Emma assured her quickly. "Just subtle encouragement to consider options they might not have thought of on their own." Before Miss Grace could probe further, they were interrupted by a knock on the classroom door. Mrs. Patterson, the school secretary, peered into the room with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Miss Grace, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a gentleman here to see you. He says he's from the law firm of Harrison, Webb, and Associates." Miss Grace and Emma exchanged glances. They had been expecting some kind of legal follow-up to Margaret's hasty financial transfers, but not quite this soon. "Should I send him in?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Yes, please," Miss Grace replied, smoothing her skirt nervously. The man who entered their classroom was distinguished-looking, with silver hair and an expensive suit that spoke of high-end legal practice. He carried a leather briefcase and moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to handling significant financial matters. "Miss Grace, I'm David Harrison from Harrison, Webb and Associates. I represent the estate management firm that has been handling certain complex financial arrangements. Miss Grace stood to shake his hand. Mr. Harrison, I'm not sure I understand. Mr. Harrison glanced at Emma, who was watching the conversation with keen interest. Perhaps we could speak privately. Emma can stay, Miss Grace said firmly. She's very mature for her age, and this situation affects her too. Mr. Harrison looked skeptical, but nodded. Very well, Miss Grace. I've been instructed to handle the transfer of assets from Margaret Stone's accounts to your name. The paperwork was unusually urgent, processed in the middle of the night with explicit instructions that time was of critical importance. He opened his briefcase and withdrew a folder thick with documents. The total transfer amounts to $1.4 million, including accumulated interest and investment growth from funds that appear to have been held improperly for approximately 20 years. Miss Grace's legs felt weak. The amount was even larger than what Emma had initially mentioned. Mr. Harrison, I need to ask, is this legal? I mean, can Margaret just transfer this money without any oversight or investigation? Mr. Harrison's expression grew carefully neutral. Miss Grace, my client was very insistent that these transfers be completed immediately and without question. She provided extensive documentation showing that these funds were held in trust and should have been transferred to you years ago. He paused, studying Miss Grace's face. Between you and me, this appears to be a case of someone finally doing the right thing after many years of questionable financial management. Emma spoke up for the first time since Mr. Harrison's arrival. What he means, Miss Grace, is that Margaret was scared enough to finally return what she stole, and she documented everything to protect herself from criminal charges. Mr. Harrison stared at Emma in surprise. That's remarkably perceptive for someone so young. Emma smiled sweetly. I've always been good at understanding how adults think. Mr. Harrison spent the next hour walking Miss Grace through the various documents and financial instruments that were now in her name. In addition to liquid cash, she had inherited a portfolio of stocks and bonds that Margaret had purchased with the stolen inheritance money. There's one more thing, Mr. Harrison said as he prepared to leave. Your aunt also signed over the deed to a property on Elm Street here in Cedar Falls. Apparently, she had recently reacquired it and felt it should be returned to its rightful owner. Miss Grace felt her heart skip a beat. The house on Elm Street, my childhood home, the very same. It seems your aunt purchased it back from the current owners just last week, paying well above market value to expedite the sale. After Mr. Harrison left, Miss Grace and Emma sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. Not only was Miss Grace suddenly wealthy, but she had also regained the house where she had spent her happiest childhood years with her beloved father. Emma, Miss Grace said finally, did you know about the house? Emma nodded. I suggested to Margaret that returning it might be wise, given the circumstances. She was very motivated to follow suggestions yesterday. Miss Grace realized that Emma had orchestrated not just the return of the stolen money, but a complete restoration of everything that had been taken from her. The child had somehow forced Margaret to undo 20 years of theft and cruelty in a single night. We should go see it, Emma said suddenly. The house. I mean, would you like to go look at your old home? That afternoon, Miss Grace and Emma drove through the tree-lined streets of Cedar Falls' most prestigious neighborhood to the house on Elm Street. Miss Grace's hands trembled as she parked in front of the elegant Victorian home where she had lived until her parents' death. The house was exactly as she remembered it, though the gardens were overgrown and the wraparound porch needed fresh paint, but the bones of the structure were solid, and Miss Grace could see her father's loving attention to detail in every architectural element. It's beautiful, Emma said softly as they stood on the front walkway. I can see why you were happy here. Miss Grace wiped away tears as memories flooded back. Playing in these gardens as a child, reading on the porch swing with her father, helping her mother plant flowers in the spring. This house represented not just property, but the possibility of reclaiming the happiness that had been stolen along with everything else. Emma, she said, her voice thick with emotion, would you like to live here with me? Emma's face lit up with genuine joy. The first completely childlike expression Miss Grace had seen from her in months. Really? You mean it? I mean it. But first, we need to talk to your parents about making this official. That evening, Miss Grace and Emma sat in the Blake family's modest living room, surrounded by the noise of the television and the casual chaos of a household where no one paid much attention to anyone else. Mr. Blake, a heavy-set man with thinning hair and a permanent expression of mild irritation, looked up from his beer and his game show long enough to acknowledge his daughter's teacher. Mrs. Blake, whose blonde hair was teased into an elaborate style that required daily maintenance, paused her nail filing to participate in the conversation. Miss Grace, Mr. Blake said with obvious confusion. Emma said you wanted to talk to us about something important. Miss Grace had rehearsed this conversation, but she still felt nervous. Mr. and Mrs. Blake, I want to discuss the possibility of adopting Emma. The room fell silent, except for the sound of the television. Mr. and Mrs. Blake stared at Miss Grace as if she had just spoken in a foreign language. You want to what now? Mrs. Blake asked finally. I want to adopt Emma, Miss Grace repeated. I know this is unusual, but Emma and I have developed a very close bond, and I think I could provide her with opportunities that might be challenging in your current family situation. Mr. Blake muted the television and looked at his daughter with the first real attention Miss Grace had ever seen him pay her. Emma, do you want to go live with your teacher? Emma nodded solemnly. Yes, Daddy. Miss Grace understands me, and she wants to help me learn things and grow up to be someone special. Mrs. Blake set down her nail file, her expression shifting from confusion to something that might have been relief. Well, I have to say, Emma has always been difficult, not like Tyler. Tyler's normal, likes sports, watches TV, doesn't ask weird questions all the time. Miss Grace felt anger flare at the casual dismissal of Emma's intelligence and curiosity, but she forced herself to remain calm. Emma is exceptionally bright. She needs educational opportunities and emotional support that match her abilities. Mr. Blake leaned back in his recliner, studying Miss Grace with calculating eyes. This adoption thing, there wouldn't be any financial obligations for us, would there? I mean, if you take her, you'd be responsible for all her expenses. Completely responsible, Miss Grace confirmed. In fact, I'd be prepared to establish a college fund for Emma that would ensure her future educational needs are met. Mrs. Blake perked up at this. A college fund? How much of a college fund? Miss Grace had anticipated this question. $50,000, deposited immediately upon finalization of the adoption. Both parents stared at her in shock. Miss Grace realized that $50,000 probably represented more money than the Blake family had ever possessed at one time. $50,000, Mr. Blake repeated, just for signing some papers, for giving Emma the chance to thrive in an environment that values her gifts, Miss Grace corrected gently. Emma had been watching this negotiation with the calm observation she brought to everything, but Miss Grace noticed her small hands were clenched in her lap. This conversation was determining her entire future, and despite her extraordinary abilities, she was still a 6-year-old child who needed adults to make the right choices for her. Mrs. Blake looked at her husband, some kind of silent communication passing between them. Miss Grace suspected they were calculating how much easier their lives would be without the responsibility of raising a child who made them feel inadequate with her intelligence and endless questions. What do you think, honey? Mrs. Blake asked her husband. Mr. Blake shrugged. Emma's never really fit in here anyway. Maybe she'd be happier with someone who gets her better. It wasn't the most heartfelt parental sentiment Miss Grace had ever heard, but it represented agreement. Emma's expression remained neutral, but Miss Grace caught a flicker of hurt in those dark eyes at her father's casual dismissal. There's one more thing, Emma said suddenly, her voice very quiet, but somehow commanding attention from everyone in the room. What's that, sweetie? Mrs. Blake asked. Emma looked directly at her parents with an intensity that made both adults shift uncomfortably. I want you to know that I forgive you for not understanding me. I know you did the best you could, even though it wasn't very good. The simple statement, delivered with such adult composure, left both parents speechless. Miss Grace realized that Emma was saying goodbye not just to her family, but to any lingering hope that they might someday learn to love and appreciate her. And Tyler, Emma continued, tell him that I hope he finds something he's passionate about someday, something that makes him as happy as learning makes me. Mrs. Blake's eyes filled with tears, though Miss Grace suspected she didn't fully understand why. Some part of her seemed to recognize that she was losing something precious, even if she had never valued it properly. 3 weeks later, Miss Grace and Emma stood in a family court in downtown Cedar Falls, surrounded by lawyers and legal documents that would forever change their relationship from teacher and student to mother and daughter. The proceedings were remarkably smooth. The Blake family had signed all the necessary paperwork without hesitation, and the $50,000 college fund had been established as promised. A social worker had conducted the required home inspection of the house on Elm Street, expressing amazement at Miss Grace's sudden change in financial circumstances and living situation. "Miss Grace," the judge said as she reviewed the final documents, "I have to say, this is one of the most unusual adoption cases I've presided over. It's rare to see such a clear alignment of interests and such obvious benefit to the child involved." Miss Grace squeezed Emma's hand gently. "Your Honor, sometimes families are created by choice rather than by birth. Emma and I chose each other." The judge smiled warmly. "Indeed, by the power vested in me by the state of Connecticut, I hereby finalize the adoption of Emma Blake, who shall henceforth be known as Emma Grace. Congratulations to both of you." Emma looked up at Miss Grace with shining eyes. "I'm really your daughter now." "You're really my daughter," Miss Grace confirmed, pulling Emma into a tight hug. "Forever and always." That evening, they celebrated in the fully restored house on Elm Street. Miss Grace had spent the past 3 weeks working with contractors and decorators to return the house to its former glory, complete with the beautiful gardens her father had once tended with such care. Emma's new bedroom was in the same room Miss Grace had occupied as a child, with tall windows overlooking the back garden and built-in bookshelves that were already overflowing with advanced texts on mathematics, science, literature, and philosophy. "Miss Grace," Emma said as they sat on the front porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Mom, can I call you Mom now?" Miss Grace felt tears of joy threaten to spill over. "Emma, I would love nothing more than for you to call me Mom." Emma snuggled closer on the porch swing. "Mom, do you think we'll be happy here?" Miss Grace looked around at the house that had once represented everything she had lost, now transformed into a symbol of everything she had gained. "Emma, I think we're going to be happier than either of us ever imagined possible." As summer progressed, the transformation in both their lives became even more apparent. Miss Grace had resigned from her position at Willowbrook Elementary, no longer needing the income and wanting to focus entirely on Emma's education and development. Emma, meanwhile, had blossomed in ways that went far beyond her already impressive intellectual abilities. With the security of knowing she was truly wanted and valued, she began to show more of her childhood side, laughing more freely, playing in the garden, even occasionally acting silly in the way that normal 6-year-olds do. But her extraordinary gifts continued to develop as well. With Miss Grace's encouragement and guidance, Emma learned to use her abilities more precisely and purposefully. She could move objects with increasing sophistication, sense people's emotions and intentions from greater distances, and demonstrate an intuitive understanding of complex systems that amazed everyone who worked with her. Miss Grace arranged for private tutors in advanced mathematics and science, while also ensuring that Emma had opportunities for normal childhood experiences, art classes, music lessons, and carefully supervised interactions with other gifted children who could appreciate her abilities without being threatened by them. One warm August evening, as they worked together in the garden that had once been her father's pride and joy, Emma looked up at Miss Grace with a thoughtful expression. "Mom, do you ever think about Principal Stone? About what happened to her after she left?" Miss Grace paused in her weeding, considering the question. She had wondered about Margaret occasionally, but found that she felt neither hatred nor forgiveness, simply a kind of detached concern for someone whose choices had ultimately destroyed her own life. "Sometimes," Miss Grace admitted. "Why do you ask?" Emma carefully transplanted a small flowering plant to a sunnier location. "I've been thinking about justice, and about punishment, and about whether people can change." Miss Grace recognized the serious tone that meant Emma was wrestling with important moral questions. "What conclusions have you reached?" "I think," Emma said slowly, "that what we did was necessary to protect you and to stop her from hurting other people. But I also think that maybe she's learning something important about how it feels to lose everything you thought you could control. Miss Grace marveled at her daughter's capacity for complex moral reasoning. "Do you regret what we did?" Emma shook her head firmly. "No, she made choices for 20 years that hurt you and other people. We just made sure those choices finally had consequences." She paused, looking up at the house where they now lived in peace and security. "But I do hope that someday she finds a way to be a better person." Miss Grace pulled Emma into a gentle hug. "You have such a good heart, sweetheart. Even when you're being fierce and protective, you still care about doing the right thing." Emma hugged her back tightly. "You taught me that, Mom. You taught me that being powerful doesn't mean being cruel, and that protecting people is more important than punishing bad guys." As autumn approached and Emma prepared to begin a new school year at the prestigious private academy they had selected, Miss Grace reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. A year ago, she had been a lonely, frightened teacher living in poverty and shadows, still haunted by childhood trauma and unable to imagine a different future. Emma had been a brilliant, isolated child trapped in a family that couldn't understand or appreciate her gifts. Now they were a real family, bound not by blood or legal obligation, but by choice and love and mutual understanding. They had created together something neither could have achieved alone. A home where extraordinary abilities were celebrated rather than feared, where intelligence was nurtured rather than suppressed, where love was based on who they truly were rather than who others expected them to be. The house on Elm Street was filled once again with laughter and learning, with the kind of warm, supportive environment that allowed both of them to flourish. Miss Grace had rediscovered the confident, joyful person she had been before trauma and abuse had nearly destroyed her spirit. Emma had found the family and stability she needed to develop her remarkable gifts in positive, constructive ways. On the first day of school at Riverside Academy, Miss Grace walked Emma to her new classroom, marveling at how different this experience felt from their time together at Willowbrook Elementary. Here, Emma's intelligence would be challenged and celebrated. Her questions would be encouraged rather than dismissed. Her abilities, while still secret, would be supported by teachers who understood that exceptional children required exceptional approaches. "Are you nervous?" Miss Grace asked as they approached the classroom door. Emma smiled, and it was the confident, happy smile of a child who knew she was loved and valued. "No, Mom, I'm excited. I get to learn new things, meet new people, and come home every day to someone who understands me." Miss Grace kissed Emma's forehead gently. "I'll be here when school ends, sweetheart. We can work in the garden together, and you can tell me about everything you learned." Emma hugged her mother tightly. "I love you, Mom. I love you too, Emma, more than you'll ever know." As Miss Grace watched her daughter walk confidently into her new classroom, she felt a profound sense of completion. They had both been broken in different ways by circumstances beyond their control, but together they had healed each other, creating something beautiful and strong from the pieces of their separate tragedies. The cycle of abuse and neglect that had defined Miss Grace's life had been broken forever. In its place was a new legacy, one of love, protection, justice, and the unshakable bond between a mother and daughter who had chosen each other against all odds. Margaret Stone's reign of cruelty was over. Emma's isolation and loneliness were things of the past. Miss Grace's years of fear and poverty had been replaced by security and joy. And in the restored house on Elm Street, where a little girl had once lost everything, a new little girl was growing up, surrounded by all the love and support she needed to become whoever she was meant to be. Justice had been served, families had been healed, and the future stretched ahead of them, bright with unlimited possibilities. The story of Miss Grace and Emma Blake was really just beginning.